It has recently been reported that the New York City Council is considering to remove public statues of historical figures such as Christopher Columbus, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington because
they depict people who owned enslaved persons, or directly benefited economically from slavery, or participated in systemic crimes against indigenous peoples or other crimes against humanity.
Conservative commentators have pointed out that this trend comes as the next phase, after many long-standing statues and monuments in America were destroyed, vandalized, or taken down in the Black Lives Matter riots that occurred in summer of 2020. One such example was the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt, which had been mounted in front of the east entrance of New York's American Museum of Natural History, until the Museum Board and the New York City Public Design Commission had it removed in January 2022. The museum's official statement on the matter cited,
"The movement for racial justice that has emerged after the killing of George Floyd, which has turned the attention of the country to statues and monuments as powerful symbols of systemic racism."
The statement further explained that the statue's depiction of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, mounted high on his horse and flanked on foot by an African on one side and an American Indian on the other, was a
hierarchical composition that many of us find racist.
The museum's decision was, of course, not without controversy, and those who opposed it defended the statue and its titular subject against this label of racism. The New York Young Republicans Club, one of the groups that organized an event to protest the AMNH's decision, contended that the monument's imagery was intended to
communicate Roosevelt's embrace of mankind,
and that the other two figures
are representative not of racial weakness, but of noble human strength.
Conservative columnist Dave Marcus, another protest organizer, highlighted Roosevelt's role in creating America's national parks and his reputation as a, quote, progressive, who looked forward to a future where people of all races would be treated equally in American society. Fox News' Tucker Carlson also came out in defense of the statue and of TR. During his show on June 23, 2020, he listed some of the reasons why Roosevelt is highly regarded among U.S. presidents today, and likewise pointed out his reputation as a champion for racial equality in America. Even though Carlson's characterization of TR was rather skewed, as this video will explain, he nonetheless made some valid criticisms regarding the nationwide crusade to remove, destroy, or deface statues and monuments, stating that, quote,
"This is an ideological movement. It is deep and profound. It has vast ambitions. These are not protests. This is a totalitarian political movement. They plan to rule this country."
Because the Black Lives Matter mob was so wanton in its destruction, targeting not only symbols of the Southern Confederacy, but also memorials to individuals who fought on behalf of the oppressed or were themselves oppressed. It is thus quite easy to agree with the conservatives when they dismiss this controversy regarding the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt as a nothing burger fabricated by, quote,
radical leftists, compelled to destroy America's pride in our history, our leaders, our people, and our successes,
as the New York Young Republicans claim. However, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and those claiming that the statue embodies, quote, white supremacy, do, perhaps surprisingly, have a rather valid point this time around. Curiously, though, even the statue's most vocal critics appear to have glossed over some of the most compelling evidence in favor of making their case. In fact, not only does Teddy Roosevelt have a problematic and troubling legacy of racism, but the American Museum of Natural History itself does also. Any serious debate regarding the statue and its subject matter demands an extensive discussion of the rather shameful and disturbing history of the involvement that both Roosevelt and the AMNH had with the transatlantic eugenics movement, and the extent of the horrific crimes that that movement produced throughout the first half of the 20th century. And thus, this video shall discuss the broader context of the history of eugenics in the United States, and explain how that context relates to the American Museum of Natural History and the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt. Of the ugly history of racism in the United States, most Americans are well aware of grave injustices such as slavery, Jim Crow laws, and the atrocities against the American Indians. Comparatively, however, little to nothing is known to the common American about eugenics, even though its effect on U.S. society was, and in some respects continues to be, rather pervasive. Even historian Howard Zinn failed to even mention the topic in his book, A People's History of the United States, of which a major focus is the history of racial injustice in America. Eugenics, broadly defined, is the theory and practice of trying to improve the health and fitness of the human race, or a subpopulation thereof, usually by encouraging the breeding and survival of those of supposedly superior birth, and or discouraging or preventing the breeding and survival of those of inferior birth. Though eugenics has been around in one form or another for millennia, exemplified by practices such as infanticide of children deemed weak, sickly, or deformed, or by inbreeding among the nobility, modern eugenics came about in 19th century England as part of a larger phenomenon of scientific racism. The term eugenics itself was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, a cousin and collaborator of the famed evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin. Galton adapted this neologism from the Greek eugenes, roughly translating to well-born. Galton became fascinated after reading his cousin's work on how selective breeding of domesticated animals produced variations in hereditary traits, such as the way that different dog breeds may vary in their physiological, behavioral, cognitive, and other attributes. Galton believed that the same approach could be applied to perfecting the human species.
To give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable.
Galton denied that any
pretensions of natural equality
existed between the more suitable races and the less suitable, and he devised a scale for ranking the
comparative worth of different races.
Anglo-Saxons and other European peoples were at the top, and sub-Saharan Africans near the bottom. The lowest were the Aboriginal Australians, who could be ranked lower than dogs,
in respect to their memories and powers of reason.
Because eugenics is so nakedly racist, most Darwinists today claim that Galton's ideas were a perversion of his cousin's work. This, however, overlooks a great deal of inconvenient facts about Darwin himself. For starters, Darwin credited the main inspiration for his theory of evolution by natural selection to the political economist Thomas Malthus. Malthus is most famous for the so-called discovery of his so-called principle that it was impossible for human societies to produce enough food to keep up with and adequately sustain a rapidly growing population. Even though his conclusions were disproven within his own lifetime, Malthus is still largely deemed a brilliant economist throughout academia today. What's less widely discussed about him, however, is that the implications of his theories cast poverty, famine, and pestilence among the teeming, unwashed masses as desirable, because they are nature's checks preventing their overpopulation. And all this is something that Malthus himself shamelessly admitted. This is why journalist and researcher Alan Chase, in his distinguished book on eugenics and scientific racism, The Legacy of Malthus, identified his titular subject as
the founding father of scientific racism for developing and propagating the first major theory of the human inferiority of the lower and middle classes.
Malthus's idea that humans, like other organisms, could produce far more progeny than can possibly survive gave Charles Darwin the basis to formulate his theory of natural selection. Malthus's essay on the principle of population inspired Darwin to
appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on, because under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed.
In Darwin's view, this struggle for existence applied to human populations as well. Thus, man was eternally locked in a brutal struggle against his brother, and the natural outcome of this would have the stronger supplanting the weaker. So, in actuality, eugenics was far from being a hijack of Darwinism perpetrated by Galton. Darwin's own views were very much aligned with those of his cousin. For example, his famous work on human evolution, The Descent of Man, was heavily influenced by Galton's work. In that book, Darwin claimed that the reason that
civilized nations are supplanting barbarous nations
through colonial conquest was because the former possessed a superior intellect gifted to them by natural selection. He also lamented that it is too often the
weak members of civilized society who propagate their kind. This must be highly injurious to the race of man.
These last remarks are revealing, because they get at the way in which Malthusians and eugenicists view the supposed problem of technological and economic progress. Many of them had this fear that the modern industrial economy had produced conditions which were far too favorable for large numbers of the weak, the poor, and other so-called inferiors to survive into adulthood and thus produce offspring. This trend in the decline of child mortality had never been achieved before in human history. Yet according to the eugenicists, by doing this, man had actually inverted natural selection. While the birth rate among the urban poor was quite high, that among society's upper strata was comparatively lower. Thus, in the industrialized England of Galton's time, the inferiors of the human race, with their higher birth rates, were outbreeding the affluent and well-born. Galton and Darwin saw this as survival of the weakest, and it needed to be corrected by putting eugenics into practice. Galton, for example, believed that any among what he called the
inferiors of the insolent caste,
who continued to beget their inferior children, needed to be
considered enemies of the state and to have forfeited all claims of kindness.
Although this foreshadows the crimes that Galton's so-called science of eugenics would bring about in the coming decades, for the time being, it was merely a part of a larger ideological movement that came about in the wake of the publication of Darwin's theories. Galton was among the many learned men who sought to apply the biological lessons about natural selection, the survival of the fittest, and the struggle for existence to the realms of society, economy, and politics. The outcome of this was the philosophy of social Darwinism. Social Darwinists sought to create a new ethical system for mankind to abide by, as the old maxims based upon the Judeo-Christian belief in the sanctity of human life and the humanist concept of inalienable human rights were deemed detrimental to mankind because they exalted virtues like compassion and altruism, which went against the natural order where the strong triumph over the weak. As Robbie Kosman, a German physician and social Darwinist, put it,
the pleasant sentimental conception of the value of the life of a human individual is an overestimate, completely hindering the progress of humanity.
And Galton too recognized that he was essentially replacing the old religious ethos of Christianity with a new one based upon his own ideas. According to Karl Pearson, one of his closest colleagues, Galton viewed eugenics
not only as a science, not only as an art, but also a national creed, amounting indeed to a religious faith.
Despite the fact that this new creed based upon this Malthusian Darwinian ideology was controversial almost from its beginning, it nevertheless caught on quite rapidly among the aristocracy and intelligentsia of Victorian Britain. Though England at this time was still a predominantly Christian nation, the cultural influence of religion had already been on the wane for several decades. Thus, justifications for racism or classism derived from the Bible needed to be replaced with those derived from science. Malthusianism, social Darwinism, and eugenics conveniently provided supposed scientific proof that those at the top of a social hierarchy that for centuries was based largely on heredity were indeed born to rule over the teeming masses of peasants. This was also when the British Empire was at its zenith, and thus this new creed was also employed to vindicate the Anglo-Saxons' dominion over what the infamous arch-imperialist Cecil Rhodes called
the most despicable specimens of human beings.
And there were many among the political and intellectual elite of Britain in the latter 19th and early 20th centuries who were disciples of this creed of scientific racism. This included philosopher Bertrand Russell, writers H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Aldous Huxley, economists Sidney Webb and John Maynard Keynes, Prime Ministers Winston Churchill, Arthur Balfour, and Neville Chamberlain, and many others. It wasn't long before these British elites had successfully evangelized many of their counterparts across the Atlantic. By the turn of the 20th century, belief in eugenics was widespread among America's largely Anglo-Saxon ruling class. When the U.S. founders established their republican form of government, distinct from and opposed to the oligarchical model that typified England and other European countries, they prohibited the creation of a formal hereditary nobility, like those found in the Old World. In the United States of America, there are no barons, dukes, lords, or counts, like there are in Britain and other European countries, and the Constitution bars any U.S. citizens who receive such titles from foreign states from ever attaining public office. However, there has long existed a kind of informal nobility of very wealthy aristocratic families that trace their roots back to the colonial era. These are families such as the Cabots, Delanos, DuPonts, Forbeses, Coolidges, Putnams, and many others, which have held a great deal of wealth and influence in the United States. This network of patricians is sometimes referred to by names such as the Eastern Establishment and the Boston Brahmins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a relative of Theodore Roosevelt, and himself a member of this privileged class, identified this element as the Tory tradition in America, a fitting name due to the fact that a number of these same families can trace their heritage back to the Tories, who kept their loyalty to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War. Indeed, even after the Revolution, many among these same families still maintain their sympathy with the British Empire and enlarge their fortunes through business opportunities with the British East India Company's international opium trade. This pro-British American Tory contingent identified very much with the notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority and global dominance being espoused by their brethren in England. And thus it was this Anglo-American upper class, comprised of both these old money families, along with the nouveau riche robber barons of the 19th century like Morgan, Rockefeller, Harriman, and Carnegie, that came to sponsor and promote the eugenics project in America. It didn't take long for the eugenics movement to become wildly popular throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. An emphasis on wildly popular. Eugenics was not merely a curious fad among some eccentric academics and dilettantes, as it's sometimes portrayed. It was very much mainstream, and it claimed true believers from quite a motley crew of prominent figures from a wide swath of political and intellectual leanings. Its adherents included 30th U.S. President Calvin Coolidge, inventor Alexander Graham Bell, Harvard President Charles W. Eliot, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Not all eugenicists were white supremacists either. African-American intellectuals such as the civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois and the prominent physician Charles Drew believed in applying eugenic breeding to improve the stock of the black race. Eugenics also took hold in Imperial Japan and meshed well with the racialist theories on the supremacy of the Yamato Japanese and their destiny to conquer the lesser races across Asia, something that is of course analogous to the way eugenics was incorporated into the Anglo-Saxon supremacist ideology of the British imperialists. Starting around the 1890s, organizations pushing eugenics and racial purity were being established in America, and the ideology they preached was soon adopted in the U.S. intelligentsia and in public policy. Restrictive immigration laws were passed, which were premised in large part upon preserving the racial purity of America by keeping out people of so-called inferior stock, such as the Chinese, Italians, Jews, Slavs, and others. Anti-miscegenation laws, though not new in the United States, nonetheless began citing racial integrity as the scientific evidence which further justified the need for preventing interbreeding between the races. And as bad as these examples are, they're actually only the tip of the iceberg of the destruction wrought by the eugenics movement in the U.S. There is one particular episode from the history of eugenics worth recounting here, which indicts these pseudoscientific theories for contributing to the needless deaths of millions of Americans. In 1914, physician and epidemiologist Joseph Goldberger, himself a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, found that the disease pellagra, which had become an epidemic among rural poor in the southern United States, was caused by a vitamin deficiency. It could thus be cured through a balanced diet of meat and vegetables, and limiting the consumption of corn, which had been the main staple of most pellagra victims. His findings, however, were contested by Harvard zoologist Charles Davenport, the founder and director of the Eugenics Record Office. Davenport believed that chronic poverty, and the ill health that often came along with it, was a manifestation of the poor not being of, quote, strong stock, and thus they were merely victims of their own inferior hereditary traits. He called this condition pauperism, and claimed that it was the main reason why pellagra was almost exclusively a poor man's disease. In 1917, Davenport and his ERO colleague Elizabeth Munsey became part of NYU Medical School's Pellagra Commission. Their role on the commission resulted in its final report ignoring Goldberger's work almost entirely. It instead favored Davenport's theory that the disease was the result of
certain constitutional and heritable traits of the affected individual.
It wouldn't be until the 1930s when Goldberger would be vindicated, and his discovery that pellagra was a disease caused by poor nutrition was accepted by the medical community. In the interim, pellagra is estimated to have directly killed 100,000 Americans, and was a contributing factor in the deaths of as many as 6 million more. Davenport's ERO was also at the forefront of a national advocacy for legislation for the compulsory sterilization of those deemed to be of inadequate stock. Harry Hamilton Laughlin, Davenport's partner at the ERO, drafted a model eugenical sterilization law that targeted drug and alcohol addicts, orphans, the homeless, the mentally disabled and mentally ill, the crippled, and so on. Variants of Laughlin's model law were passed in over 30 states, and led to the sterilization of millions of victims, most of whom were female. In many cases, these sterilization programs also targeted racial minorities, especially African American, American Indian, and Latino women. Compulsory sterilization was even upheld by an 8-to-1 majority in the 1924 U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, which has never been overturned, and astoundingly, many such laws remained in force all the way until the 1970s. Eugenics' rise in popularity coincided with what is called the progressive era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, eugenics was one of the hallmark issues of the progressive era, with a number of prominent figures in the movement, such as economist Emily Green Balch and social reformer Jane Addams, being devotees of its theories. Progressive reformer and economist Irving Fisher was even a co-founder of the American Eugenics Society. As mentioned previously, one of the most famous figures of the progressive era was Theodore Roosevelt, and like many prominent progressives, Roosevelt hailed from the upper strata of society, being born into one of America's most illustrious patrician families. The Roosevelts are descended from 17th-century Dutch immigrants who settled in New Amsterdam, the original name of New York before it was ceded by the Netherlands to Great Britain as a result of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Though the Roosevelt family tree has boasted both American patriots and Anglophile Tories, Teddy came to identify much more with the latter faction. He held a worldview that was very much in step with the imperialist fantasies of Cecil Rhodes and the like, where the Anglo-Saxon was destined to dominate the globe. His sense of racial kinship with the English influenced his foreign policy, which sought to make the USA into a colonial superpower and a close partner to the British Empire, the global presence of which he called
the greatest fact in all history.
Throughout his political career, he championed America's imperial adventures overseas, with little to no regard for the sovereign rights of smaller, less powerful countries like Hawaii, the Philippines, and Colombia. In fact, his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine could be fairly deemed as the founding document of American imperialism. It set the mold that would later typify much of U.S. foreign policy in the 20th and 21st centuries, defined by unchecked unilateral interventionism under the guise of spreading democracy and policing the globe. He saw geopolitics through a Malthusian Darwinian lens, where the races of mankind were locked in a competition against each other for access to land and resources. For Roosevelt, this made wars of conquest ultimately a good and natural thing, as they resulted in a stronger race outcompeting the weaker. Even Roosevelt's oft-lauded reputation as a conservationist and the father of America's national parks is not all it seems. The architect behind the Roosevelt administration's conservation efforts was Gifford Pinchot, whom the president named director of the newly created U.S. Forest Service, and who himself coined the term conservation. But Pinchot was also an active and committed eugenicist. As bureau chief, he had a report prepared for the National Conservation Commission, which put eugenic concerns at the center of his policies. The report's third volume, which was a contribution from Pinchot's friend Irving Fisher, made it clear that the conservationist movement,
above all, was about the conservation of the racial stock itself,
and recommended forced sterilizations and restricting marriages for eugenic purposes. These racialist beliefs of Roosevelt, Pinchot, and Fisher were actually quite prevalent among conservationists. Bronx Zoo founder and philanthropist Madison Grant, paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, and Sierra Club co-founder and Stanford University president David Starr Jordan were all quite active in both the eugenics and the conservation movements. While this coupling of the racist theories of eugenics with the concerns about the conservation of the natural environment may surprise some, the two are not as incompatible as they appear, as both conservationism and eugenics stem from the Malthusian notion of overpopulation and scarce resources. As Osborne put it, allowing the population to grow
beyond the land areas, or beyond the capacity of the natural and scientific resources of the world. This would lead to the overdestruction of natural resources.
Not surprisingly, for the eugenicists, the main culprits of this overpopulation were the teeming masses of fecund paupers, who were, as Galton had noted, outbreeding the affluent and well-born. Because much of this population growth was made possible by technological advancements that resulted from the Industrial Revolution, conservationists often blamed that for upsetting the natural equilibrium between man and nature. For a number of them, this discontent with industrial civilization and technological progress also translated into a bizarre cognitive dissonance regarding their views on indigenous peoples, particularly the American Indians. On the one hand, they had this romanticization of the Indian as a noble savage, who in some ways was envied for living a more pure lifestyle that was in harmony with the natural world. There was also this admiration for the Indian as a skilled hunter and a fearless warrior. On the other hand, the red man's savage state also meant that his race was less evolved compared to that of his white counterpart. Thus, from the social Darwinist standpoint, the Indians were inherently ill-suited for civilized life, and their displacement by a higher, more advanced people was simply the principle of the survival of the fittest at work. A lot of these ideas regarding the Indians that were prevalent among Roosevelt's circle of conservationists arose out of the American school of anthropology pioneered by Lewis Henry Morgan. For Morgan, the Indians, being a race apart from the white man, were unable to lead anything more than a primitive, hunter-gatherer way of life. Morgan believed that
the Aryan family represents the central stream of human progress because it has proved its intrinsic superiority by gradually assuming control of the earth. The passion of the red man for the hunter life is too deeply inwrought to be controlled by the efforts of legislation. This great passion for civilized man never aroused the Indian mind.
Morgan's opinion of the Indians was not too far removed from seeing them as an endangered animal species, and thus the purity of their prehistoric lifestyle needed to be preserved before they faced extinction. In 1861, while seeking a position as the commissioner of the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs, Morgan proposed to President Abraham Lincoln that the Indians should be discouraged from practicing agriculture and commerce, and that the government should reorganize the Indian territories into something akin to human wildlife preserves, where all contact with the outside world would be heavily restricted. There are quite a few aspects of Morgan's school of thought that are evident in the views of Theodore Roosevelt. For example, his 4-volume history titled The Winning of the West was in large part intended to chronicle how the Indians ultimately succumbed to the inevitable dominance of the more advanced Anglo-Americans. It should be noted, however, that Roosevelt did not end up quite as viciously racist toward the Indians as some of his contemporaries. It would seem that he did not deem them as intrinsically inferior in the same way that Morgan and his colleagues had, where they were incapable of achieving civilization, as his policy toward the Indians as president was one that sought to assimilate them as full U.S. citizens. Nevertheless, his approach to this was still tainted by a paternalistic and chauvinistic attitude. For example, he was a proponent of the allotment policy, which treated Indian lands as conquered territory and the occupants as a subject people. And though he saw education as a way to bring Indians into the modern world, he believed them merely fit for not much more than an elementary schooling, and did not think it worthwhile for them to pursue any higher education. Roosevelt's incoherent and inconsistent views on the Indians are a reflection of his incoherent and inconsistent views on race generally. Regarding African Americans, he did, on the one hand, consider them as full and equal citizens whose fate in the USA was bound to that of their white counterparts. And in some respects, he could be deemed progressive for his time regarding race relations between blacks and whites. He enjoyed a friendship with black civil rights activist Booker T. Washington, who became the first African-American formally invited to dine with the president at the White House. He also appointed a number of blacks to head various posts in the federal government, even though this was met with vicious protest from racist politicians. Yet on the other hand, he nevertheless saw the African Americans with the same paternalism that he did the Indians. Roosevelt dismissed notions of equality among the races of man as
pernicious doctrines taught by well-meaning and feeble-minded sentimentalists.
And he held a similar opinion to Galton when it came to non-whites, that though there may be a few exceptional individuals among these peoples who can be considered peers to whites, as a race generally, they are still inferior. This is of course consistent with Roosevelt's firm belief in the white man's burden, that the Europeans, especially the Anglo-Saxons, were meant to be the masters, benevolent yet conquering masters, of all other peoples. And of course, Roosevelt was also very much a believer in eugenics, who held an expressed desire that
the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. Criminals should be sterilized, and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them.
In 1916, his friend Madison Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, a tome warning about the threat that immigration and race mixing posed to the preservation of the Nordic peoples and their superior hereditary qualities. Roosevelt praised Grant for authoring what he called a capital book, and agreed with its thesis that maintaining racial purity was
the greatest problem of civilization.
Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is, of course, complex. As established, he has many defenders who regard him as one of the greatest leaders in American history, and who will contend that we must judge the character of historical figures like TR according to the mores and norms of their time. While there is validity to this argument, we must be careful not to take too relativistic an approach in this regard, lest we fall into a lazy apologism that dismisses rather grave sins. The racist, imperialist beliefs professed by Roosevelt did not exist in a vacuum. They had, and in some respects continue to have, rather detrimental, real-world consequences. Theodore Roosevelt and his family were, and continue to be, quite involved with the American Museum of Natural History. Other than his career as a politician, Roosevelt is probably best known for his adventures as an intrepid outdoorsman, and he went on several expeditions collecting specimens for the museum. Today he is even something of a larger-than-life mascot for the institution, most famously exemplified through Robin Williams' portrayal of him in the Night at the Museum movies. Presently, Roosevelt's great-grandson sits on the museum's board of trustees, and his father, Theodore Sr., was among the institution's co-founders. In fact, the charter for the AMNH was signed in the Roosevelt home in April of 1869, and others among the list of prominent co-founders and benefactors included J. Pierpont Morgan Sr., Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller. From the founding of the museum, scientific racism defined its mission. At the AMNH's opening ceremony in 1877, Charles W. Eliot declared that
the stupendous doctrine of hereditary transmission, recently acquired by science, will enhance the natural interest in vigorous family stocks, give a rational basis for penal legislation, and promote the occasional production of illustrious men and the gradual improvement of the masses of mankind.
And so the American Museum of Natural History came to be a major hub for the eugenics movement in North America. Prominent eugenicists such as Roosevelt, Madison Grant, and legislative counselor John Trevor all served on its board of trustees. Grant's friend and collaborator Henry Fairfield Osborn served as museum president from 1908 to 1933. The AMNH came to play such a central role in promoting eugenics that after the first International Eugenics Congress was held at the University of London in 1912, the conferences for the Second and Third International Eugenics Congress were moved to New York at the Natural History Museum in 1921 and 1932, respectively. Notable attendees of these events included J.P. Morgan, Herbert Hoover, Margaret Sanger, and Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin and the chairman of the British Eugenics Society. Members of prominent American patrician families such as the DuPonts, Roosevelts, and Putnams were also in attendance, and the main sponsor of the conference was Mary Averell Harriman, the widow of railroad tycoon E.H. Harriman. Speeches and papers presented at these conferences included such titles as Pedigrees of Pauper Stocks, Some Notes on the Jewish Problem, Selective Sterilization for Race Culture, Virginia's Effort to Preserve Racial Integrity, Eugenic Problems of the Slavic Race, and so forth. Among quite a few scholars and researchers, there has been a tendency to regard the widespread embrace of eugenics by so many prominent Americans as merely a reflection of the backwards prejudices common to the high society of the time. This attitude is reflected in the AMNH's exhibit, Addressing the Statue, which mentions the museum's role in promoting eugenics only briefly as a, quote,
misguided movement based upon erroneous theories.
This gives the impression that for the museum and its personnel, eugenics was simply a passing fad, rather than something that was a part of its core mission. But the legacy of the eugenics movement is much uglier than the museum is apparently willing to confront. And this even goes beyond the most abhorrent eugenic-based policies in the United States, such as the aforementioned sterilization programs. In fact, American eugenicists, especially those associated with the AMNH, also had considerable influence on the eugenic-based policies in Nazi Germany, which would pave the way for Adolf Hitler's mass extermination programs. To cite a few examples of this, Grant's Passing of the Great Race influenced Hitler during the composition of Mein Kampf. Hitler even referred to this book as his Bible. In 1934, Grant's close friend and associate Osborn was invited to Germany to receive the Goethe Medal for Art and Science. This award was presented to him by none other than the Führer himself. One of the most tragic episodes pertaining to the American eugenics movement's liability in the crimes of the Nazis occurred in February of 1939. That was when Senator Robert Wagner and Representative Edith Rogers introduced to Congress an emergency bill to allow 20,000 German Jewish children to enter the United States and be adopted into American families. In response, John Trevor and Harry Laughlin organized opposition to the bill. Their coalition included eugenicists, nativists, and racists from a large umbrella of organizations ranging from the Daughters of the American Revolution to the Ku Klux Klan. In his testimony to Congress, Guy Irving Birch of the Population Reference Bureau warned that if admitted, these 20,000 Jewish children would
increase to 500,000 in only 6 generations.
The Wagner-Rogers bill was ultimately defeated, and the children were not admitted. Most of them eventually fell victim to the Nazi gas chambers. But even this affair is not the most damning testament to the lethal consequences brought about by the poisonous ideas propagated through the American Museum of Natural History. During the aforementioned Third International Eugenics Congress in 1932, a Swiss-German doctor named Ernst Rudin was elected president of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations. Rudin would go on to help author Nazi Germany's sterilization laws, which were modeled on those already in force in the United States. Eventually, Rudin would train the medical personnel who carried out Hitler's first extermination program, targeting hundreds of thousands of mental patients. As Leo Alexander, a medical advisor in the Nuremberg tribunals, noted in his classic 1949 article in the New England Journal of Medicine, Medical Science Under Dictatorship.
Ghastly as the extermination program seems, it was merely the entering wedge for genocide of conquered nations and the racially unwanted.
Once news of the true nature of Nazi eugenics became known in the US and elsewhere, the movement as a whole quickly garnered a bad reputation. The topic of race science became closely associated with the Holocaust, and thus became a taboo subject in polite society. However, eugenic ideas did, and indeed do, live on, albeit under various other, less controversial brand names. After the war, eugenics organizations began emphasizing other, less overtly racist advocacies, such as the supposed threat of human overpopulation and the so-called plundering of the planet. Eugenicists would go on to found organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and the Population Council. This agenda for the eugenics movement to regroup after the Nazis had spoiled their party was frankly admitted by some prominent eugenicists. For example, Julian Huxley, grandson of Darwin's closest colleague and fellow Malthusian Thomas Huxley, and Frederick Osborn, the nephew of Henry Fairfield Osborn, believed that in order to make eugenics, quote, thinkable again for public opinion, they had to be careful to avoid applying the eugenic label to issues like birth control, conservationism, and population reduction, because it would hinder the acceptance and adoption of such advocacies. Thus, the organizations founded by Osborn, Huxley, and other eugenicists and Malthusians began redirecting their efforts to other causes. Much of this can be seen in the alarmism about overpopulation that became widely propagated in the post-war decades. This led to the creation of sterilization and birth control programs, quite similar to those in the US during the heyday of eugenics. Most of these programs have targeted populations in the former colonial countries of the developing world, that is, those colored races that the eugenicists have long considered inferior. Fear-mongering about overpopulation and carrying capacity has also long been a main concern of environmentalist groups, very much in a similar vein to the conservationists of Theodore Roosevelt's time. And it is no coincidence that environmental advocates, ostensibly in the name of protecting Mother Nature, have typically opposed the kind of technological progress and development of natural resources that would lead to lower mortality and create higher standards of living, and thus more population growth. All this, of course, is a more digressive topic to get into, and one probably best reserved for a potential sequel to this video. For now, it is simply worth noting that the legacy of the horrible ideas that began with Malthus and Galton, and enthusiastically embraced by Theodore Roosevelt's circle of friends at the American Museum of Natural History, is not just a relic of a bygone, less enlightened era, but in fact continues to this day. Now, all of this about the history and legacy of the American eugenics movement, and the Natural History Museum's central role in that movement, sets the backdrop for us as we return to our original question of how we ought to regard the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt. That statue is the work of a sculptor named James Earl Fraser. While Fraser did state that one possible interpretation of his work was that it depicted Roosevelt's, quote, friendliness to all races, the composition for the three figures was not his own independent concept. The statue was planned as part of a larger memorial to Theodore Roosevelt, commissioned by the New York State government in 1920, about a year after TR's death. It was the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Association, not Fraser, that had decided upon
an equestrian statue of two accompanying figures on foot, one an American Indian and another a native African, representing his gun bearers and suggestive of Roosevelt's interest in the original peoples of these widely separated countries.
Although nothing here explicitly screams out racism, a few things should be noted for context. First off, the Memorial Association at the time was led by none other than the infamous Henry Fairfield Osborn, who had a central role in how the memorial was to be conceived and executed. Secondly, the statue and memorial focus a great deal on Roosevelt's reputation as an undaunted adventurer and a valiant warrior, and these characteristics of his were emphasized by the Natural History Museum's eugenicists to romanticize TR as the epitome of the hypermasculine Aryan Superman. As Charles Davenport stated in his speech at the 1932 Eugenics Congress,
the mixture of North Europeans in the United States seems to produce many virile persons, of which the Theodore Roosevelt family is a brilliant example.
And lastly, for Roosevelt, Osborne, Grant, and their fellow eugenicists at the museum,
interest in the original peoples of these widely separated countries
included procuring, studying, and exhibiting exotic tribesfolk as if they were animal specimens. In the early 1900s, a Congolese pygmy named Otabenga was brought to live at the museum, and later showcased in an enclosure with monkeys at Madison Grant's Bronx Zoo. He would later commit suicide as a result of the trauma he endured from these experiences. Another similar case was that of Minnick Wallace and his family. Minnick was an Inuit boy from Greenland who was brought to New York with his father and other relatives by explorer Robert Peary, who encountered them during his expedition sponsored by the museum. When Minnick's father contracted tuberculosis and passed away, the museum staged a mock burial for him, but had the actual remains mounted in a museum exhibit without the boy's consent or knowledge. All of this context surrounding Theodore Roosevelt and his fellow eugenicists at the American Museum of Natural History ought to present a strong case as to why the equestrian statue is indeed an obvious statement on racial hierarchy. Its controversial reputation is therefore very much deserved, and not to be dismissed as just one of the countless examples of the woke left crying wolf. Indeed, perhaps it could even be argued that the statue's display is somewhat analogous to a hypothetical where the Max Planck Institute in Germany, the current incarnation of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which had been a hub for Ernst Rudin and other German eugenicists, proudly displaying an equestrian statue of Siegfried, the legendary Nordic hero, flanked on each side by a Slav and a Jew. But now, even as New York City officials find a new location for the Roosevelt statue, the discussion should not end there. Today, amidst the controversy surrounding this contagion, there are demands from the mass media, public officials, and other quarters that citizens must trust the science and unquestionably obey the directives of scientific experts. Now is therefore a salient moment for Americans to be reminded that the men and women who peddled eugenics were also highly respected as scientific experts in their day, and they had the backing of very powerful and prestigious elite institutions. In the early 20th century, Germany's scientists were among the foremost in the world, yet many of them had already embraced eugenics and social Darwinism decades before Hitler and the Nazis came to power. Never again is the slogan used to remind people to stay vigilant in preventing genocides and other crimes against humanity from recurring. But such vigilance requires each and every citizen to exercise his right and obligation to self-governance, whether he be a molecular biologist or a construction worker, and to ask keen questions that demand transparency and accountability from those in positions of power and influence. And it is this which is his inoculation against technocratic tyranny.